Bethesda, Maryland, 21 May 1993. We're very pleased that Professor Charles G. Robb is willing to share some of his heritage, background, training, and experience with us on a series of audio-video tapes for our living history, our oral history, to complement our efforts with our military surgical heritage. We've been very pleased, honored, and delighted to have Professor Robb with us for more than 10 years now, serving as a very distinguished professor with us, and also as our senior advisor to the Department of Surgery. He served on our visiting board and contributed to many other aspects of our academic affairs, including serving as president of the USU Surgical Associates. But I don't want to get too far ahead of things. We do need to start back at the beginning, sir, and we would greatly appreciate it, Professor Robb, if you would tell us something about your heritage, your early years, if you would, please, sir.
Well, Norman, I was born in England, and my father was a family doctor who'd been born in Yorkshire, and he practiced in suburban London, about 25 miles outside London in Surrey. He had a family practice with some surgery. He came from a long descended from a family of Scottish drovers. I don't know if you realize that before the railways, the British had, or any country, had to move large supplies of food by land. And as the roads were not good, you couldn't move them in carts, so they had to walk down themselves. And so, whilst we all know about a cowboy moving stuff from Texas to Chicago, you also moved cattle from the north of Scotland to London. And my ancestors made their living this way and did very well at it. And they used to drive large herds of cattle, which they collected at a place called Falkirk in really the northern lowlands of Scotland, and then drove them down, drove roads over a period of about a year and a half to London, where they were. One of the problems on this trip was that every village you passed saw their dinner going by, and so you had to protect this, and so they were fairly well armed to protect this large herd of cattle, and sometimes there were several thousand in one of these herds.
Yes. Oh, that's fascinating. Do you think they had a medical corps officer traveling with them?
No, I don't think they did. But I do know they were a group of them. By the way, it was quite a financial enterprise, because you had to buy the cattle in Scotland and then sell them in London and hopefully make a profit. And so, and what is, I think, a little interesting is how they did it financially, because in those primitive days, there were not the banking system they had today, but you could obtain a letter of credit, which you could take up from London to Falkirk and use that to buy your cattle with. In other words, the people accepted this letter and eventually got the money, I presume.
Was your father the first to enter into medicine, and was he a strong influence on your choosing medicine as a career?
Oh yes, very much so. He was the first to go into medicine. The others were farmers, or these drovers, and I used to help him as a boy, an older boy, 18 and older, say, with doing minor surgery and things like take out an appendix or something like that, which family doctors did in those days.
Where did he have his training?
He went to Cambridge. He went to a school in Yorkshire called Ripon. It was just a standard high school, got a scholarship to Cambridge, and graduated from there at the end of the last century, sort of 1890-something.
And settled up in the Yorkshire...
Well, he went up to Yorkshire first, and then decided to move to... London was growing fast in those days, so he opened a practice in suburban London, at a place in Weybridge in Surrey, and the place grew from a small village to a large suburban town while he was there.
Well, that's very
He started as a single practitioner and ended up with 5 partners, so yes. He made a good choice.
Yes. Well, he had a very positive influence on you. Do you remember when you first decided that you wanted to become a physician?
Well, I think really quite early on. Certainly, by the time I'd graduated from high school. I'm sure it was before that.
And as far as surgery is concerned, was
well,
that...
Well, it's the same thing. Surgery was the thing. It seemed to be the thing to do, you know. And in those days, remember, surgery was much more, it was the thing, so to speak. And it was very different also in those days from what it is today.
When you and I have discussed your ancestral background, you had mentioned on your mother's side the name of Edward Vernon. Would you mind telling us a little bit about who he was and how he fits into the interesting history?
My mother was the daughter of an Episcopal or Anglican minister who had a church in Norfolk in England. And he was descended from two interesting people. One was Edward Vernon, who Mount Vernon is called after. And the reason it's called after my ancestor is that he commanded a British fleet which was in Chesapeake Bay. And he took an expedition down to try and capture Cartagena in Colombia. The expedition was a dud. It never captured Cartagena, but he did have on his ship a young midshipman called Lawrence Washington. And he obviously got friendly with the Washington family, and Lawrence Washington called his home Mount Vernon after his commanding officer.
The time that they were in Chesapeake Bay was circa 1750, would you say?
About that, yes. I think they went down to try and capture Cartagena in the late 1740s, 1750, about that time. And then he came back and he was stationed in Chesapeake Bay for some time, and he made the rank of Vice Admiral, which is a senior rank in any navy. And then a very interesting thing happened in his case. He obviously we don't know for sure, but he was dismissed from the British Navy. You don't often fire a 3-star officer. And family tradition has it that he was dismissed because he considered a war against the Americans was mistaken because it couldn't be won. And he advised strongly against it, that's the family tradition, and was therefore dismissed from the Navy. And he then was elected to Parliament, and I understand made quite a nuisance of himself from then on, speaking against the war.
For those of us who may not remember our history all that well, Lawrence Washington was George Washington's older half-brother?
That is correct, half-brother. And he died quite young, I don't know why, and George Washington inherited the home.
Yes. Well, that's a fascinating part of the history.
There's no evidence in the family records, any evidence at all, that Edward Vernon ever met George Washington. Well, because there was a fair age difference, but I presume he did when he visited the house, because he used to sail his battleship up and anchor it off Mount Vernon and go in for dinner now and then.
Well, that's a fascinating historical connection.
Yeah.
And we appreciate the fact that you followed one of your ancestors back to the Chesapeake area and have been willing to live here and to help us.
Well, we get caught up in a thing like this.
Back in the Yorkshire area, what was it like for you as a young boy growing up?
Well, we had it was quite a large farm and a small village, and in those days farming was labor intensive. And I remember many things that are interesting. Probably the most interesting was, I would assume, about 1926, when I would have been about 12 or 13, the plough changed. Up till then it had been horse-drawn ploughs, and the new plough, which was pulled by a tractor, was a little bit deeper, and cut a sod, which is probably about 3 inches. That must have happened over here too. But what was interesting there was, because of this, in the first year we turned up 3 piles of coins. And it's clearly what these were, that the man who'd been farming the land in about the year 1000 and a little before had gone out to repel a Viking raid, because the Vikings came up the river, and he and the other local citizens had collected their bows and arrows and their swords, and before they went, they presumably hid the family in the woods and buried any money they had by a tree or something, and if it's still there, it means this is the fellow who didn't come back. He never got back, and so the coins were still left there because nobody knew where they were.
Well, that really was burying your treasure in the
That's right.
backyard, I guess.
That's what they did, yes.
What did you do with the coins, if we may
Well,
ask?
by the way, they're not, unless they were gold, and they never were. There were so many of them in that part of the world. They were Roman coins and Saxon coins, and you'd think they'd be very valuable because they were 1,500 years old or 1,000 years, but they weren't. You had to declare them to the coroner by law. You told them you got them, you took them down perhaps and showed them to him, and then he said, you keep those, do what you like with them, they're of minimal value.
You couldn't finance your medical education
No,
with
you
those
couldn't.
or
If they'd
anything
been gold, we could have.
During your high school years particularly, were you interested in any sports?
Well, we all played, at that time, the sports in Britain were cricket and rugby football. Those were the key sports, and they still are. And I played on those teams. I was never a star in any way, but I played.
Enjoyed playing.
Yeah, enjoyed playing, yeah.
What led you to decide where to go for your university education, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well,
part of
I
your life?
I went to Cambridge, the same as my father. Part of it, I think, was my father had been there, and I remember going up to look at the colleges one day with him, and then in those days it was not hard to get into university in Britain, and I presume here, because the Depression in 1929 was still it was about the time I went to university, and nobody had any money, and or very little. And if you could pay your tuition fees, the university welcomed you. And so there was no problem about getting into college. You could get in. And I went to Cambridge, and at that time it was a 3-year course, and I graduated in 1934.
Thinking about the tradition at Cambridge and the exciting time, do you have any favorite recollections of those university years?
Well, I do. Cambridge at that time, we still hadn't thought really that World War II was going to come, because I graduated, we went there from 31 to 34, and it was sufficient if, with, the various activities in Europe which led to World War II were only just heating up. And so there wasn't a problem. A much bigger problem was the problem of the Depression. And you got a lot of unemployed, and a lot of the faculty particularly the university found it hard to pay them. And so the financial restrictions were very considerable. But nonetheless, it was a good time to be at college. The medical school was good. I had some good friends. I was at St. John's College, which the room I had been built in 1449. And so it was just about the same time as Columbus set out. And an interesting thing about that room, it was comfortable when I was an undergraduate, but years later I went back as a postgraduate in December for some faculty business, and I thought it would be nice to stay in my old room. And so this was agreed to, the occupant must have been away. I had a dinner in the college hall, which was very good, went up and got into bed, and 5 minutes later I was out and in a hotel. It was too damp, cold and uncomfortable for a man who was a few years older than an undergraduate.
Well, we can certainly appreciate that.
So don't live in a room built in 1449.
Oh, that's great. Were there any particular faculty members, professors who influenced you in your university years?
Well, my tutor was a man called Cockcroft, who was a major, he won the Nobel Prize for atomic physics. And at that time in Cambridge, if you were, whatever faculty, whatever course you were applying, your tutor was responsible for your general education and not the special. So, for example, if you're a medical student, you didn't have an MD necessarily as a tutor. And I had this atomic physicist, and he was a good man, and he taught me about things nothing to do really with medicine, and he was good at it. Another man I had who was a supervisor of my studies was a young anthropologist who named Leakey, and he made a major discovery in East Africa, near Kenya, of skulls of very primitive humanoid people, and he was a very interesting man as a tutor. And of course, the faculty at that time was very good at Cambridge. There was a man called Hopkins, who was in biochemistry. He's an older man who'd won the Nobel Prize for discovering what he called accessory food factors, which we now call vitamins. He figured those things out back in some time before.
Well, certainly considerable stimulus with a number of Nobel laureates under whose influence you had your development and so forth.
Right. Well, Cambridge at that time was very strong in that kind of stuff. And a great deal of the pioneering work on nuclear physics was done there in a laboratory controlled by a man called Rutherford. And these other fellows worked with him.
Before we go any further with your education in your family, did you have brothers or sisters?
Yes, I did. I had a brother who also went to Cambridge, and he went on and joined the British Foreign Service and ended up in that. And I had a sister who married a doctor who practiced in the south of England on the coast, and my brother was younger and my sister was older.
Well, thank you very much. Recognizing that you graduated in 1934 from Cambridge, would you tell us what decision-making you went through for your additional further training and how you selected your pathway toward that training?
Well, at that time, Cambridge was not, the clinical part of medical school was not at Cambridge because it was a small town. And so what you did, you went to another university for your clinical training. And I went to St. Thomas's Hospital in London, which was a large, very large hospital at that time in London, with a very busy outpatient and emergency room. And I did my clinical training there so that I was able to graduate finally in medicine in 1937. So the course was a 7-year course. Combined with the period at college and then the period in the medical school.
Yes. How long had St. Thomas been a clinical hospital, a teaching hospital? Do you remember that?
A very long time. It used to be, it moved in the Queen Victoria's time. It had been next to Guy's Hospital, which is another London hospital by London Bridge. And Guy's Hospital is in St. Thomas Street. And Guy's Hospital, it's interesting historically because Thomas Guy was one of the first men to make a killing on the stock exchange. And back in sort of about 1500 he did this. Made a huge amount of money and endowed a hospital, and St. Thomas's Hospital then gradually declined in that site because of this new big one coming up. And then they decided to rebuild it in Lambeth, which is where it was opposite the House of Commons on the River Thames, which was where I was. And Florence Nightingale, when she came back from the Crimean War, received a lot of contributions. And she set up a nursing school at the new St. Thomas's Hospital. So we had these Nightingale Nursing School, and it became a very important hospital in the period from when the Nightingale School came there until the end of World War II.
So that was started in the late 1850s, early 1860s.
That's right. And she did a good job. The nurses were very good, and a lot of famous hospitals, even on this side of the Atlantic. The first director of their nursing school came from Florence Nightingale's training. For example, the Mass General and Columbia Presbyterian, several others hired one of her graduates.
Oh, very good. When you were at St. Thomas, were there any professors or any of your teachers who you remember particularly who influenced your training?
Yes, there were. There was a surgeon called Max Page and another colleague of his called Michener, who had both been in the War of 1912, which was a Balkan War. When we think now about Yugoslavia, but there was a war at that time between Serbia and the other nations in that area, and it was just like it was today, but it was in 1912. And people went out from the European countries to do kind of Red Cross surgery. And both these fellows went there, and this really was a sort of warm-up for World War I. And they were in this in 1912, and they served in Serbia at that time, or what is now Croatia. And then both of them were in World War I, and both of them were also in World War II. And they, as regards military surgery, Max Page particularly was a very good military surgeon and ended up consultant surgeon to the British Army in the Second World War. Another man who was very good was a man called Maybury, and he had been the assistant to George Makins, who wrote the vascular study in World War I. And Maybury continued to practice vascular surgery as you did in those days until he died. And so there was a certain amount of vascular surgery being done in the period between the two wars and at that hospital.
Well, that's fascinating history to me particularly, and as you and I have talked about several times, and as we know, Sir George Makin's bust is the third on the left as you walk in the Royal College of Surgeons of England in Lincoln's Field, Newfield in London.
Yeah.
He made a chronology which I think must have been the first on the management of acute arterial injuries, 1,202 acute arterial injuries in British wounded in World War I. So we certainly recognize that, and that was an interesting link up through Professor, was it Maybury?
Maybury. He was the fellow he was his assistant and probably continued to practice surgery until the late 1950s.
Yeah. But please tell us a little bit more about Professor Michener, because I know you went back to London a few years ago to the Royal Army Medical Corps College on the Thames at Millbank to give the Michener lecture. And you actually knew him, so that was...
Well, later on, when I got on the staff of St. Thomas's Hospital, and he was the senior surgeon on the service, and I was the junior surgeon. And I knew him very well. He'd been a very active military surgeon, and he'd been essentially became a major general in the reserve between the two wars. He didn't leave the military, and he had quite an active reserve unit, and then he served again in both wars, and he wasn't quite as good a surgeon as Max Page, but he was very good, and he was very good from a military point of view. He trained his unit, which was connected with the medical school, was a very active unit, and he trained a lot of future military surgeons who served in World War II. And then, of course, you had the problem when World War II came of the bombing of London, and both he and Max Page, particularly Max Page, were very active in providing the civilian emergency medical services at that time.
When you had a chance to give the Michener lecture a few years ago, you included this history, reviewed this for the Royal Army Medical Corps. Was
that's right.
Major
Yes, I did.
thrust?
And I knew Michener very well. He was an interesting man. He never had a huge surgical practice. And it's interesting to look back. He lived in London, practicing from 1910 to 1950 approximately, and he never owned an automobile. He always walked to work or took a taxi. And you know, if you come to think of it, he had no parking problems, plenty of taxis around, but I think he used to say that when he'd turn up at a house to see a patient in consultation without a car, that people would often ask him where his car was, and he would tell them that he found it much more efficient to travel by taxi and on his own feet.
Well, today we know in London that the underground, the tube is very efficient. When was that built? Did he write that?
No, the tube started later on when I was at St. Mary's Hospital. I got some idea of how long before it had started, because we had to extend the hospital, and we made a hole in the tube doing it. and that particular tube had been built in the time of steam trains. And they used to have vents to let the smoke out. So it certainly went back to before the days of electric trains.
Were there any other professors during your clinical training at St. Thomas that you remember?
Well, I worked closely with a young surgeon at that time who I was his first intern when he joined the faculty. And that was Norman Barrett, who Barrett's esophagus is called after. And he was a pioneer of thoracic surgery in those days. Thoracic surgery was just starting, mostly the surgery of lung abscess, tuberculosis, and lung cancer, no cardiac surgery. And he was a good man, and he really studied the esophagus, and we did a lot of esophageal surgery at that time.
Now, this would have been 1937, 1938, and was it called an internship in those days?
Well, we called it a house surgeon.
House surgeon.
Yes. You did a house surgeon, and then if your second year, if you went on to the next year, you became what is called a senior casualty officer. That means you were the senior doctor in the emergency room. And then you went on to that to become a registrar, and if you were lucky, you became the resident assistant surgeon, which is like chief resident.
Now, in those days, did you work 40-hour weeks?
No, you didn't. You worked, actually, when I became the chief resident, the senior surgeon said to me, remember, you're not supposed to take any time off. When I call the hospital, I expect you to be there.
Well, that makes it very difficult to have any type of additional outside life,
well,
doesn't
you
it?
Weren't supposed to be married as
Yes.
chief. I was the first chief resident who was ever married. But that was made possible by World War II and not other factors.
Now, did you meet your wife? Did you meet Mary during that period of time?
Well, that was during the war. She had been secretary to a man who became the Minister of Air in Churchill's government, and a fellow called Wedgwood Ben. And she decided when the war started to become a nurse, because, you know, it's a thing to do. And so I met her at the hospital, and she was they'd done about 1.5 years of nursing students time. And we got married, and that was very good. It's the first time a chief resident had been married. But the war is different. You can change things.
So you were married in 1940?
1941.
1941. And that was your chief residence year, so
Yes,
that
yes.
would have been essentially your
I
fifth
finished
year?
my fifth year, finished
Yes.
in 1941.
Yes.
I was just about the end of my residence.
During that period, 1937 to 1941, did you have contact with any other interesting surgeons or professors at St. Thomas?
Well, the Department of Medicine was fairly strong, very strong. In fact, there was a fellow called Cassidy, who was a very good cardiologist, and he had the sort of carriage trade of London, you know, looked after the king and stuff like that. And he was a very good cardiologist, and he was a very good clinician. And in those days, it was clinical practice. I mean,
Surely.
most of the tests we have today didn't exist.
Did you have any international participation, if we can put it that way? Obviously, the British Empire was still very much all over the world. Did you have people
Well,
coming?
you had a lot of people coming for postgraduate study from not only Europe, but from the English-speaking parts of the world. That meant Canada, particularly Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India and well, it's now India and Pakistan, which in those days was India, and huge parts of the world people used to come to, and you got patients from these areas. A lot of patients used to show up. In fact, I one day was in my clinic at the hospital, and there was some visitor from North America, and he said that at the end, you know, you really got to know about geography around this clinic, because these fellows turned up from everywhere.
Yes. I know you made a number of friends who remained your friends for many years. I believe one person you mentioned to me when he visited with us here a few years ago, Sir Edward Worry Dunlop.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, you met him at St. Thomas in 1939.
Yes, he was there. He actually was at St. Mary's, and he was he was there as a medical student. He was a very good rugby footballer, and he graduated a little bit ahead of me, and he trained as a surgeon. And then, of course, in World War II, he was in the Australian Army and had the misfortune to be captured and had a major problem serving with the Australian prisoners in what is now Burma.
Yes. Thinking back, I don't remember the exact dates, but if I recall correctly, the Blitz of London really started in 1940, did it not?
The first bomb to hit St. Thomas's Hospital was the 9th of September 1940. And we had 11 heavy bombs. By heavy, in those, remember, one of the great things about being bombed is to be bombed early in the war, because the bombs are smaller. As the war progresses, people get more accurate and get better. And we were bombed early in the war, and so a big bomb for us was 500 pounds. And by the end of the war, a big bomb was 5,000 pounds. And so the wretched fellows in Berlin got the big bombs, you see, and we got smaller ones.
And the hospital actually sustained 11?
We had 11 hits and innumerable firebombs. Firebombs came down all the time, great clusters. And we had 11 hits with what we called were large high explosive bombs. And they'd take out a corner of a hospital or a block. But you know, hospitals are big places. And the place never closed, although it did drop down once to about 8 patients.
One of the things you told me about a number of years ago was the initial description of crush injury by a group of people who were there with you. Bywaters, I think, was one of them.
There was that called Belsey, Miles, Bywaters, and others. And crush syndrome, crush injury, was described in the Blitz, and several of the cases occurred at St. Thomas's. We had one I shall never forget. We had a very pleasant physiotherapist who was sleeping with the other physiotherapists when a bomb hit her part of the hospital, and she was trapped in her bed with a heavy steel girder across her legs, about the level of the upper thighs, and the legs were totally ischemic from this. It took about, to get her out, you had to have heavy-duty jacks that brought in, and they'd raise this girder, and by the time they'd be in and set up, it's about 12 hours. And we raised the girder with a jack, slid her out, and before that she'd been talking happily, had an IV running, and she died immediately.
Yeah.
Because we released the crushing injury.
And that was described in...
That is one of the patients described in the thing, and I was there, and it was very dramatic and a shame, really, because I don't think you could have done a lot differently with the knowledge we had at that time.
Well, you know, we have reviewed a lot of wars and a lot of history. What was it like to be in a city, in a hospital, with the fear of incendiary bombs at any day, every day? How did morale hold up?
Well, first of all, I think morale was very good. We were bombed in London, I believe it was 100 consecutive nights. And to start with, they bombed in the daytime, and they lost too many planes. You'd have the planes coming down, quite a lot of them. I remember once there was a fighter plane, German fighter plane, was shot down by the hospital, near the hospital, and crashed down. Proximity was a magistrate, and the pilot was brought in. He'd bailed out. And I never forget this, because he came in and he spoke a little English, and he was a nice fellow, and he had an enormous welt on his head. And I asked him how he'd felt with how it had gone, and he said, well, I bailed out all right, but when I got on the ground, it was that old lady with the frying pan who hit me on top of the head, and she was the problem.
That's a great story.
But seriously, I think the bombing of London seriously brought morale very well together. I believe people felt that the war was just, and it really made them fight. I'm absolutely sure that if you bomb civilians, you've got to kill them or don't bomb them, because if they don't get killed, they get annoyed and they fight back a lot harder than they would be if they hadn't been bombed. And I'm sure the same thing happened in Germany and happened also in Hanoi and Haiphong.
Yes. Knowing that you had this bombing to look forward to every day, how did that alter the traditional schedules? And I say schedules, recognizing you would say schedules.
Schedule. No, what we did was first of all we were down to we didn't keep patients overnight. if we could help it. We had a transport system to a hospital in the country, and we had emergency work only. And the bombing would start a little after dark, probably about, in the winter, about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, in the summer much later, and finish at dawn. And you got very used to this. You'd be, the hospital would be, you'd be living in the basement, and you'd sort of start to hunker down. And the operating room was in the basement, and we never closed. We kept going all the time, and it was a very, the experience, I think, was quite good, because the students did well, the attendings, most of them disappeared to the country. You never saw them. But the resident staff and the students and the nurses did a good job, and we really, the hospital, and of course you still had a working city. It had to work.
Yes.
And so people commuted in and out a lot, lots slept there. And the casualties to our hospital, we had, I think, about 6 people killed in the hospital, but none of them were patients.
Yes. Have you ever taken time to visit the War Room where Winston Churchill spent a good part of that era and so forth?
Yes, I have. That's just across. See, we were just across the river from that.
Yes.
You've got the House of Commons, then Westminster Bridge, and we were immediately opposite the Houses of Parliament. And Winston Churchill's War Room was in Westminster, not too far from the House of Commons.
That's a fascinating
Very small.
area. Very small, isn't it? And to imagine how they lived there and how it was really the nerve center for the defense.
I don't think people realize how small accommodation can be. But if you want to stay down below ground, it has to be small. But of course, a lot of people slept in the tube trains, in the tube tunnels. And there were a lot of people who used to go down there every night. And people were very good about that. They'd leave a bedding roll of stuff, and nobody stole it, and it was there next night when they came down.
Yeah. No, it's certainly a fascinating time, a tragic time. One of the tragedies that we both know is that one of the bombs did hit the Hunterian collection, if you will, and what John Hunter had assembled. Do you remember some of the statistics about his?
Well, he had a lot of stuff, and I don't know the statistics, but that was some of it. Some of the very unusual specimens had been transferred to. What they did was the College of Surgeons applied to the members who had reasonable homes in the country, and a certain percentage of these specimens and other important pieces of historical importance in the college was shipped out to the country. And by the way, other organizations did that.
Yes.
And so there was quite a lot of the special things in London were kept in 15, 20, 30 miles out. And we had our country hospital, you see, near Guildford, which is about 35 miles out of London.
Yes.
And that was where we did all the elective surgery.
Knowing your interest in history and the fact that we have a medical historical section here, and we've talked a great deal about our military surgical heritage, when you were in your training, did any of the professors mention John Hunter by name or mention what he had done?
Yes, I think they did. Of course, that time he was still ligaturing arteries. And so his method of ligaturing the artery for popliteal aneurysm I'm sure, was mentioned many times, because it was a standard treatment at that time. People were not putting in vein grafts at that time.
Again, from the military surgical heritage standpoint, John Hunter, unknown to many, many people, was the equivalent of the British Surgeon General under Wellington, circa 1795, I guess. He went on the Peninsular Campaign.
He was in the Peninsular War, which went on for many years, and that was fought in Portugal and Spain. And Wellington had an army which was combined with British, Portuguese, and Spanish. And this gradually increased, and finally, at the end of the war, they were actually got up into southern France. I think they got as far as near Bordeaux, having worked up over a period of about 10 years. And really all they did was, while Napoleon was fighting the Russians and Austrians and others, they kept enough divisions down in Spain to be a nuisance.
Other than John Hunter, and since you mentioned Napoleon, we all recognize that Baron Dominic Larrey was the surgeon to Napoleon. Later, and particularly in Waterloo, was there a British surgeon of some renown who was with Wellington?
Well, what happened at Waterloo was that the army was put together quite quickly because Napoleon escaped from Elba, where he'd been, and he had his whole period of escape to the end, to his final defeat was about 100 days. And so the British army was shipped over quickly, the one that fought at Waterloo, and they didn't have much in the way of surgeons there for except the routine regimental surgeons. But a whole lot of important civilian surgeons were coming over to staff hospitals, sort of Red Cross hospitals and other things in Brussels, which is just back of where Waterloo was. And there was a fellow called Bell from Scotland, for example, who went over and did a great deal of surgery, but he arrived the day the battle ended, so he was not there for the battle, but he was there to look after the wounded.
Well, and he must have been quite an artist also, because didn't he make a lot of drawings?
He drew a lot, and he was. They were some horrendous drawings, and of course the wounds at Waterloo, or any war at that time, were horrendous because amputation was the standard treatment.
Yes.
Huge numbers of limbs, and it's very interesting to think of how these amputations were done, because there was no anesthesia, and.
Well, one of the reports that I read, and it was probably by Bell, he said it was the unfortunate soldier with a minor wound that fell into the evacuation chain because they knew only one treatment, and that was amputation. And there may have been some amputations done that...
I'm quite certain a lot of people got their limbs amputated before wound debridement and excision was properly developed later on.
We here in this country have heard so much about Waterloo. There are obviously different ways of remembering the history and so forth. One of the stories that I think Colonel Bob Joy, our consummate historian, has mentioned was supposedly Wellington was observing the late afternoon part of Waterloo when one of his soldiers asked him, should I take out this French officer across the way? And Wellington supposedly responded by, no, that's Larrey at work. Don't shoot him. Do the British acknowledge anything like that?
The British say that it was the Germans.
Oh.
They're the same thing. There's a similar story, but at the end of Waterloo, the Germans arrived about 2 hours, kept arriving at the end.
These were the Prussians, mainly, they call them.
The Prussians. The Prussian army arrived, and the Prussian was they were a very good army. They previously fought a battle 2 days before, and they marched in, and they got there starting at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 6 o'clock there were quite a lot of them there. And they captured Larrey, and he was, at least that's the British story, and he was now going to be shot, and some Prussian surgeon or officer recognized him and said, "You can't shoot that man, he's a good surgeon."
Well, that's good. Under the Geneva Convention, supposedly physicians are not supposed to be treated as prisoners of war, and so we did make a little bit of progress later.
Well, I think that came later with the Geneva Convention.
One other bit of history that you've told me several times that I would appreciate having you repeat, the victorious British Army from Waterloo did go subsequently to another battle in 1815, the next year, and you've told me about that, the Battle of New Orleans in the
That's right.
United States.
Well, that first of all was a mistaken battle because it was they weren't the people who were at Waterloo, but they were mostly the veterans from the Peninsular War. They were veteran regiments, and probably the most interesting thing you see one day, it's worth seeing, is you go to northeast Scotland. There's a cathedral at a place called Dornoch, and there's a memorial there to the Seaforth Highlanders. And it says essentially that there were 500 or whatever it was, Seaforth Highlanders at the Battle of New Orleans, and 150 of them were killed, or some figure like that. But it says on it, due to bad leadership.
Well,
The actual memorial says that.
the opposition had the Kentucky Rifles, which had a better range, I guess,
the
that type of
brown-based
thing.
musket.
Well, certainly there have been a lot of wars, as we've acknowledged many times, and you had your training developed during one of those. We would, in the next hour, like to concentrate a little bit more on your World War II experience, but before we finish this first tape, let's think a little bit more about those years in London, and we would appreciate any other thoughts that you might have about those years. And I guess one place to begin to stop so that we can start again is to ask when you actually entered the British Army and the Royal Army Medical Corps. Was that right at the completion of your training?
Well, what happened was that when World War II started, I was in Canada. I was doing an exchange at junior resident at Royal Victoria, Montreal. And obviously you go home when something like that happens. So I went home in September 1939. And when I arrived in London, I went to see Max Page, who was now the consultant surgeon to the British Army, and he said, "The army's full. We don't need you now. It's much better if you finish your residency." So I went back to St. Thomas's and became the chief resident, and the moment I'd done the chief residency, which was late 1941, I joined the British Army.
Were you in a reserve officer
Yes, I
position?
Actually, my original reserve was in the Air Force. And when I was at college, there was a system of you could train as a pilot in the Air Force Reserve, and I did that. I never got to be a tremendous pilot, but I trained with them. And then when I came back, of course, I was now an MD. And it was interesting, there were a lot of people, medical students with me, who had military experience. If you were a pilot or an infantry officer and an MD, they wanted you as an MD. But one of our fellows had commanded a submarine, and he was considered to be more valuable as a submarine commander than as a doctor. He was the only one who was drafted back into his military service.
Thinking back at your becoming a pilot, that was at Cambridge?
Yes.
And how many hours did you fly to qualify?
Well, quite a lot. The basic, several hundred in the end, because used to do a military summer camp. We used to go to somewhere on Salisbury Plain, a place called Netheravon, and there we'd go for a couple of weeks. And then you'd fly at weekends, and you'd go out there usually on a Friday evening to a place called Duxford, which is near Cambridge, and is now a very famous Air Force station, because it was the station where the Polish fighter squadron served during World War II, and there's a very good museum of Duxford now. Yes. But in those days it was just a training station where we kept the airplanes and flew them at weekends.
I've seen advertisements of that air museum, and they must have quite a collection of airplanes. Have you had a chance to go back?
I haven't been there since it became a museum. But I remember it very well training. It was a small, nice airfield. It was a fighter field in World War II. And the planes I started on, the original, were World War I planes. I trained on a thing called an Avro 504, which could land itself. It was, the top speed was about 90 miles an hour. We then trained on a thing called the Bristol Fighter, which had been a very good plane in World War I. And then we moved forward, and the last plane I flew was a thing called a Hawker Fury, which was a biplane and was the predecessor of the Hurricane. The next plane was the Hurricane. And that was fairly fast, to about 200 miles an hour, the Hawker Fury.
Now, did that Hawker Fury have a pilot and a gunner?
There was a model. It was type one was a single-seater, and the other one was a two-seater with a pilot and a gunner.
Yeah.
Two models. It was called the Hart if it had the two seats, and the Fury if it had just a pilot.
Oh, that's fascinating, and fascinating that you had that type of experience. When you did enter active duty, did you have credit in the system for that previous experience?
Yes, a slight amount, yes. And that was one of the reasons when I did active duty, I ended up with the Airborne Division because of that thing, yes.
Well, that's very fascinating experience. You finished your formal training, your chief residence here at the end of 1941,
Yes, just at the very end of 1941.
and that's when you and Mary were married.
We were married just before.
Just
We were
before
married-
that.
So
And then
I
you-
was married as chief resident, and it's interesting to look back. She was fired from the nursing school because you couldn't marry a doctor in those days and go on nursing. I was allowed to continue working, and she had a friend who was a nurse whose father was a general, and his daughter was fired too, where she married somebody, and he made a fuss in the House of Parliament, and they passed a law saying you couldn't fire a nurse for marrying a doctor in wartime.
Well, that's
But
fascinating
Mary
too.
was fired first before the law passed.
But you know, it's interesting in a wartime situation where every person is really needed, that they would still have that old tradition in effect, isn't it?
One of the great things in World War II was people really got into the war after they bombed London. And as you probably know, the British were the only country, apart from the Soviet Union, who actually drafted women in World War II.
Yes.
The Russians did it, and the Germans didn't have to because they could get workers from all these other countries. But the British were getting short of people, and so they drafted women. And Mary's sister, for example, became a visual signaller in the Royal Navy.
In this country today, there's so much discussion about the role of women in combat. At the same time that this controversy was raging, I happened to look at one of the obituaries in the Washington Post of a Russian woman fighter pilot from World War II who was quite a famous woman fighter pilot. Did the British have any women that served in that type of a role?
Well, they didn't have them as fighter pilots, but they had a thing called Ferry Command, which flew planes across the Atlantic and, in other words, delivered aeroplanes. And a lot of that was done by women. They used to fly planes across the Atlantic and also to the Soviet Union. And there were a large number of females. And Mary's best friend, for example, was a major in the anti-aircraft artillery, commanded a battery of guns in the defense of London, and actually shot down a plane, which is something.
Oh, that's great. In 1940, one of the very infamous battles, I guess we should say, Dunkirk, certainly has been written about a great deal. Sitting in London and your training as a surgeon, do you recall rumors that you heard at that time, or
Oh yes.
how did
Well,
you?
first of all, we knew Dunkirk was going on because they turned up patients. We had large numbers of patients. Trains came up from the coast, carrying, surprisingly enough, a lot of French soldiers. Obviously, the French wounded were evacuated that way, and we also had British, but there were a lot of wounded. And the hospitals filled up with these wounded, and we looked after them. And then the radio, you knew what was going on, and then Churchill took over as Prime Minister and made his famous speeches, which we all remember. Dunkirk, I remember, I never was there or anything like that, but my brother had a very interesting situation because he was the British Foreign Service was the British Vice Consul in Liège, Belgium. And that was it's a frontier town, and was very important in the 1940 breakthrough because one of the key operations was an attack by German glider troops on a very important fort controlling the river crossing at Liège called Eben Email. And he watched this because he was British force, but he knew where they were coming because through his office the German battle plan had been forwarded to the Commander-in-Chief 2 days before. And so John knew where they were coming and when they were coming. Unfortunately, the Commander-in-Chief couldn't do anything about it because the French army was locked up in the Maginot Line without transportation. And you could only get it out by train, and that wasn't too easy.
Yeah.
And so very little was done, although we didn't know, and I think that's one reason perhaps why Dunkirk was a success. The British did the command, at least the command knew which way they were going to come.
Yes. Well, in military tactics, that's certainly a very interesting part of history. The French anticipating the Maginot Line would hold, and the Germans just went around it.
That's right.
How many times in warfares have armies gone around
That's
whatever's been put up
That's
to
right.
stop them?
And you couldn't get that army out of the Maginot Line. That would have probably take several weeks, I think.
That being one of the very memorable parts of World War II, you alluded to something else, and that was Churchill's broadcasts over the BBC. At that time, did you find yourself listening to him?
Oh, very much so. They were very effective, very good. They certainly, it was one of the main ways of rallying the nation. Churchill, you see, we'd had the previous administration, everybody felt had been a little soft. It hadn't tried hard enough, and it wasn't. It didn't make people want to fight. And then Churchill came over, and the whole thing, and plus the bombing of London, changed things round dramatically.
Well, I guess we go back to 1937 and Chamberlain's capitulation to Hitler over Czechoslovakia and so forth that certainly attest to that. But I think your observation that once the civilian population begins to be bombed, they get involved and then they want to fight, and that's
really
certainly what happened. Since you knew Prime Minister Winston Churchill in later years, did you ever have an opportunity to talk to him about any of his World War II?
A little bit, because he was my patient for sure back in the middle 1950s when he was an older man. Not in detail, no. But he was by then he was getting a little bored, I think.
Yeah.
He was retiring from politics. He didn't know what to do, and he would talk quite a lot, and you would, rather like you interviewing me, I could interview him.
Well, we appreciate your talking, and this is really very fascinating. We have accomplished our mission on this first hour, and as I say, I would like to concentrate with you on the second hour on your experience in the British Army in World War II. But did you enter the Army the minute that you finished your training?
Yes. Again, you see, I had this fellow Max Page, who I knew very well. He was consultant surgeon to the British Army. So I just called his office up one day and said, he told me to call him when I finished my training. So I called him up and said, my training finishes, I forget the date, sometime in the fall. And by the way, in those days, it just went for a year, and the timing was all out. And I just called him up, and essentially I joined the Army the very next day.
Your rank was, we would say lieutenant, but you say lieutenant? Lieutenant.
Yeah, no. What happened was you joined at that rank, and then if you became a fully trained surgical specialist, which I was actually, but I didn't do that although I wouldn't get awarded that rank because of the job I took.
Was there any difference, like we have a first lieutenant and second lieutenant?
Oh, yes, very much so.
So you came in as a first?
I came at the bottom rank.
Well, second lieutenant
Yes,
then.
right. Started at the bottom. You got to start at the bottom.
Being a doctor didn't make any difference then at that point.
No.
Because even in our system, when we still had the first lieutenant, we came in at least at that as physicians.
Yes, but I think part of it probably was the job Max Page advised me to take. And that meant that I was kind of at the bottom all around.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Robb. We'll appreciate continuing this, and we are grateful to you for your willingness to help us with the military surgical heritage, sir. Thank you.